guys, today we're going to be talking about speciation and how does one species diverge into multiple species. So before we start, I want you to read Understandings 10.3.4 through 5, and then I want you to brainstorm this question. What are some things that might cause one species to become multiple species? So, speciation is the evolution of a new species from an existing species, and this change in species can arise for a lot of different reasons. One of the key components to speciation, however, is some sort of isolation of a population. If there's isolation between populations, it will prevent breeding throughout the species and therefore will encourage speciation within that animal. So this, of course, takes time. It can take several generations before a change is large enough to categorize an organism as a new species. And just to review, the definition of a species is organisms that are able to interbreed. Okay, so that is one of the key components to a species. Speciation can happen, like I said, it's all about isolation, but there's a few different types of isolation. The first type of isolation is called geographic isolation, and this results when there is the development of a permanent barrier of some kind that separates the local population. It could be natural, it could be flood, fire, drought, islands, or it could be a man-made barrier, such as a road, reservoir, or park. This in turn will lead to something called genetic drift, and genetic drift is the random change in gene frequency in small isolated populations. So this is a case where a small sample of a larger population becomes isolated, and the new group has a slightly different expression of the genes of that population, and they become more expressed within that new group. So over time, genetic drift occurs where that small isolated population is going to kind of favor a certain set of genes that's maybe not favored in the larger population. So that small group no longer completely represents the genetics of the original group, and genetic drift has occurred. Other types of isolation include temporal isolation. This results when members of the population have different timing for their different cycles, especially those cycles that involve or that are important to reproduction. In this case, there may be no opportunity for interbreeding among certain members of the population, and eventually, similar to geographical isolation, this will lead to a change in the gene pool and the allele frequency. Similarly, there's behavioral isolation, and this results when members acquire distinct differences in their growth or different mating practices. And this difference can include variations in the body markings of the breeding members or even mating rituals. So these learned behaviors then are unfamiliar maybe to the larger population, and so again this small group becomes isolated because of behavioral differences. Speciation can actually also happen in asexual reproducers such as plants. This is interesting because it's actually a genetic issue, a mutation, a chromosomal mutation usually. And so this occurs when polyploidy is experienced within the organism. So when an organism has two chromosomes in a homologous pair, so think about Down syndrome. If the sperm has two and the egg has one, then the offspring ends up with three. Evolution can occur, so this will cause that organism that produced asexually, meaning that it pollinated itself, to have a very distinct change in the chromosomal structure. again making it unable to interbreed with other organisms of the same population and leading to a new species because of that addition of a chromosome. Alright, so those are the main routes of speciation. We talked about geographical, temporal, behavioral, and then polyploidy. One term that I want to introduce before I get into this slide is the term deme, D-E-M-E. And a deme is what you would call a small isolated population that is prone to speciation. So members of the deme will resemble one another more closely than they resemble members of the larger population. And when we're talking about speciation, we can actually categorize it into two categories, allopatric and sympatric. Allopatric mechanisms involve always physical separation. Physical separation, like we've talked about earlier, prevents the gametes of different demes from meeting, and so mainly allopatric speciation is going to be our geographic isolation. So there's some sort of physical barrier preventing the organisms from ever even crossing paths. Sympatric, on the other hand, are mechanisms that involve demes in the same location. So in a sympatric speciation, there's one of the other types of isolating factors that prevents members, even though they may be in the same area, prevents members from reproducing. And so this reproductive isolation, like we talked about, is due to temporal mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms, or polyploidy. So all three of those go under the sympatric category. Okay, so of course this takes a lot of time. It takes many generations usually. And so timing, when we're talking about this type of speciation or this type of evolution, is somewhat difficult to define. But there's two theories about how this timing might work. So the first is a theory called gradualism, and this is the observation that evolution by natural selection is exceedingly slow. So this essentially says, we've got these tiny changes over time, and they just take a long, long time to occur, and eventually we get this divergence of these two species over a great long period of time. The longer they're isolated, the more different they become. The next theory is called punctuated equilibria, and this is a theory that there are, rather than being very gradual and continuous, there's more of these abrupt steps in speciation. So things that happen suddenly that cause kind of larger sudden changes. So things such as the environment becoming unfavorable for some reason, the occurrence of a mass extinction, or if there's some sort of, massive disturbance that really affects the future gene pool. For example, all of the organisms with a particular gene are susceptible to this disease or something, that would cause a very abrupt change to the gene pool, potentially leading to speciation. One specific example of speciation that's been observed is called transient polymorphism. And transient polymorphism is a process where one allele progressively replaces another. It's largely due to natural selection, which we'll talk more about a little bit later, but one of the organisms has a competitive advantage over another. I shouldn't say organism. One expression of the gene pool has an advantage over another, and so is, more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce. One example of this is the peppered moth. It was found in large numbers in urban areas of Great Britain, and at the start of the observation, most of the moths were this white kind of spotted color. They were very well camouflaged on aspen trees and buildings and things like that. And so they were dominant over the black moths. But as kind of the Industrial Revolution began, everything became covered in soot from burning coal and whatnot. And so there was a very distinct and very quick change to to select for the black moth surviving rather than the white. And so people, very noticeably saw that those white moths were somewhat disappearing while the black moths were able to thrive because now they were better camouflaged. So it was an interesting thing because then, soon after, the Clean Air Act was introduced, and the moths actually returned to their previous balance, where the white were more, naturally competitive, and the black were selected against. On the flip side of this, we have balanced polymorphism, and this is when two alleles coexist, and one is not necessarily more selected for than another, and the proportion of both alleles are maintained by natural selection because both have an advantage of some kind. We see that in the example of sickle cell anemia. In areas where malaria is prevalent, someone who is heterozygous for sickle cell anemia is more likely to survive malaria. However, normal cells are also selected for because sickle cell anemia is dangerous and deadly for a homozygous person. So that's an interesting case of balanced polymorphism where both of those characteristics are selected for in some way. All right, so that's the end of topic 10.3. Please write down any questions you have, and we'll talk about them in class. Thanks.